So, welcome today to chapter 16. We're going to talk about cartilage and bone regeneration. We're going to talk about concepts and definitions that are not necessarily, or we are not necessarily going to cover the whole content of the book chapter, but specific concepts and definitions and figures that will help you to understand what the cartilage and bone is about. So, in order to start, we're going to discuss cartilage, type of composition, cells types, regeneration. How do you induct cartilage repair in terms of autologous chondrocyte implantation or ACI? We're going to talk about different biological strategies, cells, scaffolds that orthopedic surgeons and orthopedic researchers use to regenerate cartilage with tissue engineering approaches, and we're going to do the same with bone. The most important thing about bone is going to be the concepts of biocompatibility and especially vascularization, because one of the main differences between cartilage and bone is cartilage is, when we talk about cartilage, is very low vascularized, so it has very low amount of blood vessels. However, bone is quite highly vascularized. And when we regenerate bone, we have to take in consideration vascularization. We're going to talk about biocompatibility properties of bone scaffolds um, and how they can be used to generate the best strategies for regenerating bone. So one of the two main uh, um, similarities between cartilage and bone is the origin. The origin of both cartilage and bone is the mesoderm. And the mesoderm is one of the three germinal layers that we have in the embryo. The other two are the ectoderm and the endoderm. We're not going to talk about these. You can see more on chapter 3 on embryology. But what we will do is to talk about the the two types of tissues that are derived from the mesoderm, which are two very important types of connective tissue, both being cartilage and bone. So when we talk about cartilage, there are actually three very specific types, three types of cartilage. One is the articular cartilage. The second one is the elastic cartilage, and the third is the fibrous cartilage. Um, in this book, we're going to focus mainly on articular cartilage, which you can see in the joints. For example, the knee joint, the hip joint, in the ribs, nose, trachea, larynx. The elastic cartilage, you can find it in the ear, and the fibrous cartilage, you can probably find it. You most probably find it in the intervertebral disc in the spine, right? So we're going to focus mainly in articular cartilage in this chapter. Going forward, we're going to talk about we will talk about how cartilage can be used to drive bone formation. And when the the fetus is being developed in the mother's womb, uh, limbs like the arms or the legs can will start developing. And this is, for example, an example of the developing femur. You can see this is a long bone, usually the femur, and it starts with soft template, hyaline cartilage template, as you can see in gray here. Um, you can see that there's a little bit of a bone being formed in the long part of the forming femur, and the cartilage that is the template is hyaline cartilage. You will have also a primary ossification center, which is a center that is going to start becoming hollow and hollow as the distance, as the growth progresses. So it's going to be growing up and down or proximally and distally. And this ossification center over time is going to cavitate or is going to start getting hollow. The cartilage matrix is going to deteriorate. And you're going to start having a hollow tube with the initial formations of what we call the trabecular bone. Trabecular bone is more like the spongy bone. We will see examples of what trabecular bone is compared to what cortical bone is. But at this moment in time, the only thing that we need to know is that this initial tube is going to get hollow. It is going to get initial pores and connectivity between the pores, and we will talk about trabeculae in the next slides. But what we want to show is that the more the cartilage, the more the bony structure grows, the the central parts are going to start losing cartilage, and the cartilage is mainly going to be focused on the distal and the proximal ends. The more the bone grows, more blood vessels are going to start infiltrating from the periosteal location of the bone. The periosteum is basically the layer. It's a layer that has a lot of nerve endings and a lot of blood vessels. The periosteum is where, for example, if you have a tendon here, it's going to be connected with the muscle, right? Um, so, or if we talk about ligaments as well, ligaments and tendons are going to be basically connected to the periosteum, right? So this also induces the integration of blood vessels in the central part that is becoming more spongy, as I said, becomes more spongy, and more blood vessels are going to start growing inside to give to help the integration or to bring in nutrients, oxygen, um, and everything that the bone needs to keep growing. The cavity is going to get bigger and bigger over time, and you're going to have more integration of blood vessels. And in the end, or at the both ends, there's going to be a second ossification center, as we see here. Um, and obviously, more bony matrix is going to be present, and less cartilage matrix is going to be left um, as the bone grows. In these ossification centers, the location of these ossification centers is the epiphysis of the bone. We're going to talk about what epiphysis, diaphysis, metaphysis is in the next slide. But what we will see is that in these epiphyseal regions, which are also locations for secondary ossification centers, you will start getting hollow structures, spongy structures, so blood vessels will start growing in to integrate nutrients into these locations. Over time, there is going to be a large or a more mature bone, and these ossification centers are going to be filled with the spongy bone, filled with blood vessels, and the articular cartilage. In this case, when we talk the hyaline cartilage, which is another word for articular cartilage, is going to be covering only the ends of bones, the distal and the proximal ends, right? Um, the reason why we call it hyaline cartilage is because it has a very high presence of hyaluronic acid, and hyaluronic acid is one type of glycosaminoglycan or GAG. We will talk about what GAGs are and how they are in and why they are important in the metabolism and in the engineering of cartilage. So this articular cartilage is very important because it serves as a protection to the bone in both ends. And as you see from step 5 to step 1, what we had is like a disappearance or less articular cartilage. We started with something that is highly soft or very soft and mainly cartilage to something that is less cartilage and more bone. In this case, more spongy bone, and the walls are going to be more stronger or more compact, and the name for this is compact or cortical bone, or compact. You will see many of these definitions in the glossary of the chapter, so you can basically look back when you need to remember what these definitions mean. Um, yeah, this is more a slide that explains the different structures of bone. But since we're talking about ossification centers and the what we call endochondral ossification, I wanted to talk about what the structure of what are the different structures of bones. So you can see here a femur. This is a femur, a long bone, hollow in the center. In the center, it's basically a very high or as important reservoir of bone marrow. Here we say it's containing red marrow because bone marrow uh, is important for the synthesis of cells in the immune system, red blood cells. I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to talk a lot about the hematopoiesis or the non-hematopoietic cells that are hematopoietic, meaning the production of blood, basically, and the non-hematopoietic cells like the myeloid and lymphoid type of cells, specifically, that are produced in the bone marrow, and all this dynamic of the bone marrow that is basically out of the scope of this chapter. So it's important to realize that bone marrow has different characteristics. As we can see here, the reservoir of bone marrow is the center of the bone, of the long bones, this medullary cavity. And as you can see here, red marrow is usually produces um, blood cells, red and white blood cells, and as well as platelets. And is mainly red when we are young. However, as time progresses, uh, it becomes yellow in adults. And yellow marrow is basically a reservoir for adipose or fat storage. And this is used for energy production. This is the periosteum that I discussed about, which is the soft tissue layer that covers the bone. The long section of bone is called the diaphysis. Once you start having these secondary and primary ossification centers, there's going to be a leftover of articular cartilage that is called the epiphyseal line, and the external part or the outer parts of this epiphyseal line is going to be the epiphysis, and this region right here, so this is going to be the epiphysis, or let's do it here, epiphysis, and this one is going to be called the metaphysis, right? Again, metaphysis and epiphysis, very highly regions where you have spongy bone. The periosteum is where you can see there's a entrance of locations where you can see nutrient and arteries and blood vessels. There's the cavity of the diaphysis called the medullary cavity, and yeah, the as I said, the external covering of the bone is called the periosteum, and the internal cover of the hollow channels is called the endoosteum, right? And the walls that make the bone uh, strong are basically made of compact bone, or the other name is cortical bone, which you can see it here, right? Cortical or compact bone. This is a cross section of how the bone looks like a pie type of cut. You see how this spongy bone has all these trabeculae, which are like these structures, quite um, oriented in a way like a web or like a net, that are mainly hollow, so they can keep the marrow inside, bone marrow inside, and blood vessels as well. And you can see here the periosteum, which was something that we already discussed. So those are the different types of locations of the bone, where the epiphysis, metaphysis, and diaphysis are. Where what is the epiphyseal line? Where does the epiphyseal line comes from? As I said, comes from the leftover articular cartilage that is there to show differences between primary and secondary ossification centers. This is articular cartilage, as I said, and that's pretty much the structure of bone. Let's talk about the cartilage now. Specifically, cartilage is about 65 to 80% water, and the rest, which is the stroma, right? We call it stroma, is basically tissue and cells. That's what we're looking here. And in cartilage, you have the stroma is about 35 or let's say 20 to 35% of of the content of the cartilage, and water is 65 to 80%. So as you can see, cartilage could be like a sponge that attracts a lot of water, and we will explain why cartilage holds a lot of water and forms a sponge. And you can see that it should be a material that will, or is a material that line the joints. I mean, what we're looking here is the knee joint. It's a figure that is not in the book, but it's a nice figure of sagittal cut of the knee joint. Here you have the patella, here you have the femur, here you have the tibia, and you can see here is in the tibia and in the femur, as well as in the posterior face of the patella, you will see articular cartilage. This basically is the protection um, of bones, so they don't touch with each other. So the femur doesn't touch with the patella, the femur doesn't touch with the tibia. That's why you have these protective layers, which are articular cartilage. Um, it's very important to understand that this cartilage, if you take a cross section of the cartilage, like a plug of the cartilage, which is this nice cube, you will see that you have 4 different zones: 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each zone has their own material, or the composition is sometimes different. The direction of the fibers that make the cartilage are also different. and the amount of cells also, is also different. So we're going to discuss the different zones that we can see in articular cartilage. The first one is the superficial zone. The superficial zone is basically the zone that has contact with the outside world. In this case, it's the outer region of articular cartilage, right? Um, it's mainly collagen, but also has this important protein that is called lubricant. And lubricant is there because we need to lubricate the surface. So it's not a dry surface, but a surface that can slide. You will see that, for example, the femur will move as a hinge, right? And for that, you need nice lubrication. So there's no friction, there's no shear stress. So that's why you need something that is very, very smooth. These layers are very smooth and with these particular proteins that help to lubricate the surface. So that's the superficial zone, quite strong and also lubricated. The second one is the transitional zone. The transitional zone is where you will see probably collagen type 4. The next is the radial zone. In the radial zone and the calcified zone, you see that the fibers of the collagens are more vertical compared to in the superficial zone, where you can see vertical as well as horizontal layers, right? In this radial zone, you will see mainly collagen type 4, sorry, collagen type 2. You will see a tide mark between the radial zone and the calcified zone. It's very important to see this tide mark because from zone 1, 2, and 3, mainly everything is collagen, but in the calcified zone, you're going to see cartilage that start to get calcified, hence the word of the, hence the name of the zone. And you will see that you will start having more calcification and more subchondral bone. So subchondral means under the chondrule, under the cartilage, right? So there's a more calcified region. This green region here is more calcified with mineral. What kind of mineral do we have here? Usually in bone, it's called hydroxyapatite. And in the book, you have the specific chemical formula. We're not going to tell. We're not going to mention that here. And underneath you have the subchondral bone marrow, right? As I said, all these locations are nice reservoirs of bone marrow. As I said, if this is an old or adult person, it's going to be a red uh, bone marrow compared to a yellow bone marrow or of the young individual. So those are the different um, uh, regions, orientation of fibers, and mainly the components. Type collagen type 2 is one of the main components of cartilage. You can also have different proteins and different what we call proteoglycans, which are molecular structures that have sugars and have proteins, and we will discuss more about how they look like in a minute. Um, and the tide mark here, as I said, is the place where you can differentiate between main collagen to collagen that starts to be calcified. These are the different types of collagens. We're not going to dive more about a lot on that. You have collagens that make fibrils, like collagens type 1, 2, 3, 5. Collagens that make that are associated to fibrils, as you can see here, 12 and 14. But mainly collagens that make sheets. Sometimes you need that kind of aggregation, which is collagen type 4. Collagens that are making beads to be integrated into filaments, which is collagen type 6. So there are different types of collagens, right? And you will see different types of collagens. The reason why this is important is because these different type of collagens are going to be located in the different zones of of cartilage. And the most important thing is that you can see that despite of being tissue that is not vascularized or innervated, it has a very complex architecture, and with very important properties of protection, properties of lubrication, um, and that's why this tissue is quite complex and difficult to regenerate. Um, so yeah, it's quite interesting to say the least. The structure and the architecture of cartilage. About the specifics of the extracellular matrix, the extracellular matrix is everything that is outside of the cell. Here we have a nice figure of the chondrocyte membrane, and how the chondrocyte uh, is um, in contact with extracellular matrix. And in the book, we discuss about different regions of the extracellular matrix, right? And we can say first, or the most, or the closest location of matrix is called the pericellular matrix, right? All this location here. The territorial matrix is a location here, and the interterritorial matrix here. So the chondrocyte is very nicely packed with the extracellular matrix. The chondrocyte also is connected with the different components of the extracellular matrix via these cell surface receptors. One of the most important ones is CD44, as you can see it here, because CD44 is going to have a tight connection to hyaluronic acid. And what is hyaluronic acid? As I said, it's a glycosaminoglycan that is part of the extracellular matrix of cartilage. And here is a better image that you can see. It is not in the book, but we can use to see that it's basically uh, fibers of collagen type 2. As I said, collagen type 2 is one of the most important collagens in cartilage, and then it's intertwined with fibers of hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is an important glycosaminoglycan in cartilage. And then these glycosaminoglycans have linking proteins, and in these linking proteins, you will have other brush-like. You can see these are like brushes, um, brush-like structures, which can be chondroitin sulfate or hyaluronic. So basically, cartilage has three important glycosaminoglycans in their structure. Glycosaminoglycans are structures that are sulfated, so they have sulfur atoms in structure. And the main three that you can find in cartilage is the chondroitin sulfate, CS, dermatan sulfate, DS, and keratin sulfate, KS, right? And these are the different glycosaminoglycans that you will find linked to the main string of hyaluronic acid. And you can see what we called linking proteins, like these red dots are basically proteins that are used to connect glycosaminoglycans, the hyaluronic acid to chondroitin sulfate, for example, right? In this case. So it's quite complex. That's why the glycosaminoglycans can, in the book, we say that can be aggregated or non-aggregated. And these ones that are not aggregated are basically the the protein, as I said, the linking protein with the glycosaminoglycan. They're very specific and have very specific functions to create the extracellular matrix of collagen, of cartilage. Something that is very important is that hyaluronic acid, HA, is highly chondroinductive, right? So it's going to make more uh, cartilage. And there are some medical products of hyaluronic acid that can be injected into the knee joint to hopefully regenerate the cartilage, because if there's a cartilage layer and there's a lesion, so the location, very specific location is broken, the injection of hyaluronic acid hopefully can regenerate the cartilage. Um, so that's about the extracellular matrix. We can see here more about the different zones. There are additional figures of the subchondral bone, the calcified cartilage, the tide mark. How do you see it? How's the arrangement of the cells? And how the glycosaminoglycans are highly negatively charged can be integrated with the backbone protein. In this case, could be hyaluronic acid, as I said, right? And then with linking proteins, which are these ones, will serve as components of the extracellular matrix. And you can see here that everything is going to be connected to this, important larger fibrils, which are usually collagens, right? So it's basically a decoration of the extracellular matrix cartilage is a decoration of collagen fibers with many other structures. And these structures are called the proteoglycans because they have sugar structures and proteins, as you can see here. And they can be decorated. And they can be decorated into the collagens, into the hyaluronic acid, and the individual brush-like structures are going to be called glycosaminoglycans, right? So, as I said, proteoglycan is equal to proteins, could be linking proteins, plus GAGs. And the three GAGs are chondroitin sulfate, dermatan sulfate, and keratin sulfate. So that I hope that is clearer now. We're going to see an histological slide of interesting cartilage with the chondrocyte. Chondrocyte is the main cell in cartilage. The territorial matrix, as I said before, is a matrix that is really in the vicinity of the chondrocyte. And chondroblasts are initial phases or early phases, differentiation stages of the chondrocyte. You will see that everything, the chondrocyte and the territorial matrix will form a lacunae. That's what we call the cartilage lacunae. Yes, so here it's very important to understand that units of summation of chondrocytes make a chondron, right? You can have 1, 4, up to 7 or 8 chondrocytes in the chondron. So chondron is basically a different chondrocytes with the pericellular matrix. And these chondrons, what they do is they protect the chondrocyte from compression and from external mechanical forces. So that's why, despite of the articular cartilage being subjected to a lot of physical forces, mechanical forces, the chondrocyte is not squeezed and is not elongated or compressed too much. And that's why they're protected from external physical forces. when we walk, when we jump, when we play, when we basically go about our daily lives. Now we're going to change a little bit of gears and talk about cartilage lesions and the development, how they happened. Specifically, this example is your figure 16.5 of your book, and how these examples show that the early regeneration of cartilage is quite high. In this case, in the fetal cartilage, the regeneration is high. However, when we become adults, the regeneration is low. We lose that capacity to regenerate cartilage because, again, we lack vascularization and we lack innervation, right? And here, what you can see is there was injury made by the scalpel. It's very specific, very highly located in one region. And after 3 days, what you see is that the location has been filled with cells that are dying, that are necrotic. However, 7 days later, this region here has already been filled with extracellular matrix. All these collagens or your proteoglycans or your glycosaminoglycans have been synthesized, and the chondrocytes or the chondroblasts have basically increased in size, increased in number, and have been metabolically active to deposit extracellular matrix. And after 28 days, you can see that there's no gap anymore. There's a very nice uh, and very uniform distribution of cells, hyper or very high cellularity. And basically nothing happened in these cases. And it's certainly um, uh, a scientific mystery to elucidate what are the reasons of losing regeneration as we grow older, right? Um, in the meantime, we should generate, as I said, strategies to engineer new cartilage. And here you can see a beautiful cartilage that is protecting your femur. There's your tibia. Meniscus is also cartilage in a very specific type and orientation. We're not going to talk about meniscus much. But there's a nice distance, right, between the femur and the tibia. There, the the layer is quite uniform. Um, there's no injuries. But look what happens when injuries start to happen, right? When progressions or mini fractures or mini damages are happened over time, they can over time degenerate into what we call osteoarthritis. So overweight, lack of physical activity, other diseases can accelerate cartilage damage. They can trigger the formation of these bone spores. They can narrow the joint space. And then here you will see connection or contact between the femur bone and the tibial bone. That's super painful. Starts or triggers um, inflammation, and it will basically trigger to replacement of the whole knee joint with artificial knees, right? These are titanium knees, titanium joints. We will not talk about that, but that's the problem with osteoarthritis. You start with localized injuries in the joint, and over time, and uh, and the loss, the decreasing quality of life, you will find osteoarthritis. And osteoarthritis has different phases or different stages, stage one, two, three, four. And the more you progress into the phases, the least effective the tissue engineering strategies are, and then surgery is the only solution. Mm, one of the important conditions to, regenerate, or the strategies to regenerate cartilage, is this autologous chondrocyte implantation, right? If you have an isolated lesion in your cartilage, it will be thick, or it will be, if we see the lesion will be something like that. Probably the shape of the lesion will be quite irregular, or sometimes here you can see a very irregular uh, lesion. But this is a lateral view of the lesion, right? You'll have a hole here that you would like to fill in with cartilage. Hopefully, a cartilage that has the four zones, heterogeneous composition of the extracellular matrix. You know, all your collagens type 2, 4, 7, 10, or your GAGs, or your decrin sulfates, or your keratin sulfates. So, and obviously, the encapsulation of your chondrocytes with your chondrons and your pericellular matrix and everything. So it's quite complex what your requirements are, or the requirements to create a cartilage-like material. So one of the first strategies was to just get some biopsy of cartilage from a region that is not very close to the joints, that doesn't experience a lot of mechanical forces, digest the extracellular matrix, and uh, keep the cells. For that, you need cultivation, you need a lot of time, 10, 11 to 21 days, to get many, many, many cells. For that, you need specialized cell culture conditions and cell culture facilities to get the right amount of cells and inject that back into the site. So you inject back the chondrocytes into the site, and then you put a cover on top, which is the periosteum, right? I already said that the periosteum before. The periosteum is that type of soft tissue that protects the the long bones, or the bones, so you can get a periosteum flap from the tibia and put it on top, and then suture the lesion and hope that chondrocytes can do their magic. However, this has had good clinical results, but it's quite complex because you need a facility. The facilities for cell expansion are quite expensive. Not many hospitals have this kind of facilities, and also you cannot. Now we've seen that if you expand chondrocytes in a flat plastic surface, the chondrocytes, right, they lose their differentiation, or they de-differentiate into something that is not chondrocytes. That's why you need to cultivate these cells probably in three-dimensional scaffolds, and hence that's why you need all these different types of fabrication techniques that you've seen in other chapters to create the right scaffold that can mimic the structure of real articular cartilage. Um, Maybe you will need some bioreactors to um, activate the chondrocytes to start depositing more extracellular matrix or cartilage-like matrix. You will need to work with the porosity of these scaffolds so the cells can go inside or remove waste products after the metabolism of the cells. You can either fabricate the scaffolds with the material and the cells at the same time. So there are many conditions in which you can improve this autologous chondrocyte implantation. And there are some strategies now being tested into the clinic to make this a one-step process inside of the OR to minimize costs and times and become safe and efficient strategies to solve these lesions. Because, as I said, the more lesions you have, the more degeneration you have, the more chances to create or to end up with osteoarthritis, and that's something that you don't want, right? For your knees, for your patient. This is just a figure of how the chondrocytes look, spindle-shaped, uh, spindle-shaped cells that lose their phenotype because, as we saw before, chondrocytes are not used to grow in only one layer, right? In one layer, they're used to be in three-dimensional layer, in a three-dimensional structure um, inside of the knee joint. So certainly, we need to improve the culture conditions. Um, there are many different cell sources to regenerate cartilage. You have the autologous cell sources. You have mesenchymal stem cells that you can differentiate them into cartilage. So you have the autologous cells that we already talked about. You have the mesenchymal stem cells. You have the induced pluripotent stem cells. You can have embryonic stem cells as well. So which one to choose from, right? It's quite many options in the plate. So that's why we need to find the best strategies to create the most optimal strategies or the most optimal treatments to give to our surgeons so they can ultimately use them in their patients. In terms of scaffolds, we already discussed about a little bit about the scaffolds, right? They need to be scaffolds that have the right porosity and the pore connectivity. So cells can uh, populate the whole scaffold. You need these scaffolds to be biocompatible so they don't um, trigger immune response, right? You need, hence, you don't want to trigger any inflammatory conditions. The knee joint, yeah. You don't want to trigger pain. You don't want to trigger swelling with your material. The material, whatever scaffold you do, has to be tailored or has to be fabricated. So all these three-dimensional or biofabrication strategies have to be used to create a complex tissue. Um, these materials have to be absorbable, have to be degradable, because you want eventually the cells to deposit their own extracellular matrix, which is cartilage-like matrix, and the material over time will degrade. So these are all the traditional conditions or criteria for scaffolds in tissue engineering, cartilage tissue engineering. And also, one more is maybe to have a scaffold that is smart enough to understand the stages of degeneration, right? Maybe you want to create, depending on the stages of osteoarthritis, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Maybe you want to create your scaffold that works better for the different stages, right? And tailor scaffolds that really understand the injury site, really understand the regeneration um, stages, and can match and can understand and can have a crosstalk between the injury site and the material. So now we're going to discuss about bone. We already have talked about this figure and the functions of bone. Functions of the skeletal system is structural support, obviously to protect body organs, to help in locomotion, and to maintain that mineral balance, because bone is a very important reservoir of calcium, phosphate, and other minerals and proteins. Just like in the case of cartilage, for example, cartilage is an important reservoir. If we talk about cartilage, is an important reservoir of water molecules. And why is that important? Because as we said, glycosaminoglycans, which is a very important part of the extracellular matrix of cartilage, are sulfated um, structures. They're mainly negatively charged, and they can attract and interact with water molecules, right? And that's why water serves as a cushion or as a sponge that can allow cartilage to be compressed under mechanical properties, under mechanical conditions. Um, on the other side, bone, as I said, is a reservoir of calcium, phosphate, and other minerals. It reacts also to hormones like parathyroid hormone, and has an interplay and endocrine interplay between the calcium and the phosphate concentrations that you have in the body. We're not going to talk much about that, but what we want to say is that bone is a very highly metabolic tissue. It aids in the hematopoiesis, which is the formation of blood vessels, or blood cells, sorry, like the red blood cells, monocytes, for example, and different other types of blood cells that you can find. We already mentioned that bone can remodel and renew throughout life. Um, as I said, it's quite metabolically active. So there's a very important turnover ratio of bone. It's not static. It has two different types, like we said, the cortical bone, which is mainly external, very strong parts, and compact bone, and the trabecular bone that we already discussed before. The main component of compact bone is hydroxyapatite, which is a mineral. And the main component of the extracellular, and the main component um, of the organic part of bone, hydroxyapatite is the inorganic part of bone. Of the organic part of bone is collagen type 1. Collagen type 1 is a fiber formation type of collagen, and what you will have is an organic structure of collagen in an anisotropic orientation or oriented in the long axis of the bone, right? And there's going to be deposited crystals of hydroxyapatite, and that's how mineralization happens. And mineralization happens over time. Bone also has other type of proteins and lipids that are part of the structure. As I said, the mineral part is important for the rigidity and the compressive strength of bone, and the inorganic part, collagen parts, are more give a more elastic and flexible capacity to the bone. There are different types of cells in bone. Um, Three important ones. The osteoblasts, OB, they are like bone formation cells. The osteoclasts, OC, like bone consuming cells. And the osteocytes, which are specific types of osteoblasts that are encapsulated in the matrix of the bone. As I said, the extracellular matrix of the bone is different to the cartilage because here you will have mineral and you have collagen type 1 mainly and a small amount of proteins and lipids. We know that, for example, since bone tends to remodel and renew, you will need the intimate action between bone forming cells or osteoblasts and bone consuming cells or osteoclasts. And these osteoclasts have are derived from myeloid precursors. And these are type of white blood cells that give rise to monocytes and macrophages. Macrophages are important cells in the immune system that can help to consume extracellular matrix or tissue. Um, so that's why these osteocytes are a specific type of cells that are there to consume bone to release acids to dissolve the extracellular matrix and the mineral phases to consume and remodel bone. We already discussed about the diaphysis, the metaphysis, the epiphysis, so we're not going to go more into that. We're going to see specifically what the cortical bone looks like, right? We've seen the internal location of the trabecular bone, this spongy-like bone, but this specific cortical bone is quite interesting because it has this circular type of structures with a channel inside. And these structures are called the osteon. The osteon is layers of extracellular matrix, so the collagen, mineralized collagen, with these encapsulated cells that are called the what? They are called the osteocytes, right? We already discussed that before. And in the center of this quite important uniform cylindrical structure, you will see a canal, right? A hollow canal. It's called the Harvasian canal. And this Harvasian canal is there to contain vessels, blood vessels. So you will see that many of these vessels that are nutrient blood vessels will come from the periosteum will infiltrate inside of the bone of this cortical structure, and they will go up and down through the Harvation canals, right? Because bone is highly metabolic, you have many of these cells, osteocytes that are highly active, metabolically active, and you need to give them the nutrients. That's why you need important blood vessels, arteries, and veins. That arterioles and venules that go um, up and down, and sometimes even horizontal between the canals. And these horizontal connections are called the Boltzmann canals. So it's a quite complex structure, very highly organized, and that makes the whole structure of bones quite interesting. And the strategies to create um, tissue engineering um, options are quite complex at the same time. It's important to mention that the periosteum, for example, has high concentrations of what we call skeletal stem cells that can be used for regeneration, can be used or can be active when a specific location of bone needs to be regenerated. And something that we have to say is that the regeneration capacity of bone is higher than the regeneration capacity of cartilage. One of the reasons is because these structures are highly vascularized, and that's why we can immobilize a broken bone and induce fracture repair. And we will talk about what fracture repair actually means. So that's what we can say at the moment about bone. How do we make bone? So we have two different structures or two different strategies: intramembranous ossification and endochondral bone formation. Intramembranous ossification is mainly used to create flat bones. Flat bones, for example, like the bones that we have in the scapula, flat bones in the iliac crests, and endochondral ossification is mainly for formation of long, more uniform bones, like the femur. This would be more for scapula. And to create intramembranous ossification, first, what we discussed, the skeletal stem cells, need to have a template or need to be differentiated into osteoblasts. And we already discussed that the osteoblasts are the bone B of bone formation or bone forming cells. And these osteoblasts are going to first create, if we're looking at uh, non-mineralized matrix, a more soft cartilage type of matrix, and the intramembranous ossification is going to basically ossify this membrane-like structure. So it's going to be the osteoblasts are going to mineralize the bone from the two sides of this membrane, right? And start depositing hydroxyapatite and the mineral parts of the bone to create something that is flat, right? No more than a few centimeters, right? 1-2 centimeters. But if we want to create something that is quite long, we have to remember what we saw before about dosification centers. And what we will see is that first we have clusters of mesenchymal stem cells that, again, are going to deposit a cartilage template that is going to grow both distally and proximally to create, the ossification centers, primary and secondary ossification centers, and then formation of these regions of cortical bone, integration of blood vessels, integration of primary ossification centers, secondary ossification centers, and that's how new bone is formed. So the explanation that we did before was mainly focused on endochondral bone formation, with the formation of the hollow regions of long bones, and these hollow regions are going to be basically integrated by blood vessels, trabecular or spongy bone, deposits of bone marrow in the center, and then articular cartilage at the end to protect the both streams of the bone. So it's a quite complex, multifactorial process, both of them. And as tissue engineers, we really need to know how the body regenerates bone so we can try to emulate and accelerate these these events with the biomaterials, with the growth factors, with the small molecules, with cells, primary cells, engineered cells, genetically modified cells. Many strategies that are around that we should be aware of. So when we talk about fractures, bone, maybe we walk around, we fall, we break. Obviously, the stronger the bone, the higher the cortical bone, the less prone our bones are to break. But with age, with disease, um, with metabolic conditions, people could have more brittle bones and be prone to fractures. So we can talk about different primary or secondary healing, but I'm going to focus more on the secondary fracture repair. Usually the primary fracture repair is mainly done by creation of uh, structures that can connect the distal and the proximal ends that are very, very close from each other, 0.01 millimeter to 0.01 millimeter, right? So that is very, very small in distance. So microfractures could be fixed by creating these cutting cones between the two sides, and then the osteoblast will come and deposit new bone, right? The formation of these cutting cones is made by the osteoclasts, and then the osteoclast will come and start depositing new bone. It's very, very tiny fractures, small fractures that may not be detectable in x-rays, for example. But when you need a large fracture repair, and there's a big gap, for example, or there's an important distance between the distal and the proximal end of about, say, 0.5 millimeters, 1 millimeter or so, you will need to trigger the secondary fracture repair mechanism, right? For this, you will need to trigger first what we call the acute inflammation. So there's going to form a large hematoma, a clot formation that is very rich in fibrin, and we're going to start recruiting in the site stem cells or the skeletal stem cells that we have discussed before. And these skeletal stem cells could come from the periosteum or the bone marrow. The second stage after the hematoma is the soft callus formation, triggered by endochondral ossification. We have already discussed about that. The acute inflammation can start also, or can happen thanks to the intramembranous ossification. So the secondary fracture repair uses both strategies, intramembranous ossification and the endochondral bone formation, right? Takes advantage of these two mechanisms to form a semi-rigid cartilage, right? That eventually can be mineralized, forming a hard callus. And once you have this hard callus, like a blob, I mean, this is one end, this is the other end, and this is like the mineral deposit, the bone, right? And then there's a mineral deposit. You need to have a fourth phase, which is the remodeling. So then your osteoclasts, like bone, because we call them the bone consuming cells, these osteoclasts will start eating or chipping uh, parts of the bone that we don't need to create nice bone repair, right? This is very important, and there are many growth factor small molecules that cells can trigger to create the bone. The growth factors that are more important in these events are the bone morphogenetic proteins or BMPs. But also, these kind of stem cells, the skeletal stem cells, can be triggered to differentiate to endothelial cells and vascular cells, because we already said that these regions have to be highly vascularized so they can survive. It's not only enough to put the mineral matrix, but also we need to introduce and induce formation of blood vessels. So the vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, is quite important to promote formation of the blood vessels. There are other type of growth factors that are important in this interplay, in this entirely orchestrated sequence of events. which are the fibroblast growth factors and TGF beta as well, transforming growth factor beta. So that's how the body induces a fracture that first has to be kept immobilized, have to be reduced. Reduced meaning we have to put the distal and the proximal end in close proximity. We don't want the distal end like that and the proximal end like that. So that's why we use casts, or surgeons use casts, or external fixation devices like screws and other techniques and plates to to approximate the bone together so the body can create this important fracture repair mechanism. However, we need to find ways, and the field is finding ways to create specific cells, materials, growth factors, drug delivery strategies to accelerate the formation of bone and to even create new bone when, if we say, the distal and proximal ends is too big, right? Matter of several centimeters, 4, 5, 6 centimeters, too big, that fracture repair, in situ fracture repair cannot happen, then we have to make sure that we have strategies for these critical size defects that are quite long, so we can create new bone. And there are strategies also in the field that are targeted to fix critical size defects. It's very important for us to understand the type of stem cells because cells are very important um, players in the regeneration of bone. These stem cells, these skeletal stem cells, have a prolonged or unlimited self-renewal and have very high differentiation potential. They can be used to regenerate bone, cartilage upon implantation in vivo. And at the same time, these skeletal stem cells can form the hematopoietic environment that, as I said before, is the environment or the bone marrow-like environment that we will be using to create the blood cells, right? So how can we differentiate and get all these cells from bone marrow, and how we can separate them to identify the type of phenotypes and the type of cells that will create not only new bone but also bone plus um, the bone marrow environment. So in this case, what the figure is saying is that you can make an aspirate of the bone marrow and put it in the tissue culture plastic, and only a subset of the non-hematopoietic fraction, meaning that the hematopoietic fraction is the type of cells that are not going to attach into a surface, right? Into a tissue culture plate. And these are the type of cells like red blood cells or the progenitors of the red blood cells that are not going to be attached. But the non-hematopoietic fraction, the fraction that is actually going to be attached to the surface and by default to the extracellular matrix of the bone, are going to be attached, and they are going to have specific cell receptors. And these cell receptors can be used to separate the different type of cell subpopulations. So if we want to separate the osteoprogenitor cells, for example, meaning that the cells that will create bone, the osteoblasts, and hence the osteocytes, We can find ways to separate that, in this case, via antigen recognition and antibody presence to identify specific receptors or antigens in the cell that can be used to separate between the osteoprogenitor cells and the selection of other cells that can be used to create the bone marrow environment of, of the bone tissue. So if we separate the osteoprogenitor cells, we're going to see that if they are implanted in back into a small animal, for example, in the back of the animal where you just have soft tissue and muscle, they're going to form only bone matrix, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. But these osteoprogenitor cells, by definition, are not going to produce anything that is inside of the hollow tube or the trabecular bone, which is bone marrow. However, um, if we can select by selection of antigens and antibodies, we can select all these other populations of cells, subpopulations of cells, that not only can produce when they are injected back into an animal, back into, say, muscle of an animal or soft tissue of an animal, they are not going to only produce or be able to synthesize bone by bringing in osteoblasts and osteocytes or populations of osteoprogenitor cells, but they are going to also be able to bring in populations that can create bone marrow. As I said before, there's a lot of lipid or fat inside of bone, and bone marrow has adipocytes. Adipocytes are fat-producing cells. As I said, within the bone marrow, what do you have? You have blood vessels, and blood vessels are going to be basically made by endothelial cells and pericytes. Pericytes are those blood vessels, cells that lay the outside of the walls of the blood vessel and are there to maintain the blood vessel, right? So there are going to be some fibroblasts, and there are going to be also osteoclasts. So there's going to be a nice creation of a more bone-like environment if you're able to separate only the osteoprogenitor cells that can make bone with the other subpopulations that can make bone plus the bone marrow environment. So that's a very nice experiment in which was demonstrated that bone or the bone cells have different differentiation potentials and different regeneration potentials. Something to think about is that in the case of an injury in a bone, in a fracture, the cell environment can definitely affect the differentiation of the different cells. For example, you can have a constitutive potential of a cell within the bone environment and a regulatory potential of a cell within the bone environment. For example, when we talk about the constitutional or the constitutive potential, a pericyte, which, as I said, is attached to the outside layer of the blood vessel inside of the bone, is pericyte. as a differentiated or terminally differentiated cell, will be able to go back to the mesenchymal stem cell state, get activated, and become a medicinal mesenchymal stem cell, which has the potential to, if there's correction of the fracture, it can go back to become the original state, which is the parasite. However, as I said before, depending on the microenvironment and depending on the demands, this medicinal mesenchymal stem cell can have two specific phases or fates or roles. One is to become immunomodulatory, because as I said before, in order to create regeneration, in order to create a metabolism, in order to generate all these hematopoietic cells that are not adherent and are part of the immune system, you can aid or prime or induce these medicinal stem cells into talk, connect, um, activate different T cells, T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, dendritic cells, which are antigen presenting cells, regulatory T cells, um, and other type of cells of the immune system to do something that the body requires. For example, if you need to have cells, B cells that are that will secrete antibodies, you need to create or create a high population of medicinal stem cells within the bone marrow environment to actually help prime or help to aid the generation of B cells, T cells, or dendritic cells. So the bone environment has a very important role, or the bone marrow has a very important role in the activation of the immune system. But not only that, that same medicinal stem cell can also become a regenerative cell that will understand what is the regenerative microenvironment within the bone to keep cells alive. For example, if we need to synthesize more bone, we will need to keep the cells alive, and cell will secrete factors that are anti-apoptotic or anti-scarring, right? If we need to remodel the bone, we want to create a nice uh, uh, outline of the bone and not create scars. Or we will need to create more cells, and in terms of, in this case, activate the mitotic potential of the cells to increase the number and the size of the cells. So it's very important to understand both the constitutive phenotype of the cell. So two type of phenotypes of our skeletal stem cells will be constitutive phenotype and the regulatory phenotype. And this all depends on what is the microenvironment, what are the demands, and what does the bone needs to do in order to regenerate or prime or help trigger immune responses. We know that we already discussed that most of these soluble growth factors that the stem cells, that the medicinal stem cells, mesenchymal stem cells will secrete are going to be BMPs. So you can have BMP2, BMP4, BMP7, which can accelerate the fracture, accelerate the fixation, for example, of external prostheses into the bone for bone fixation. Again, at the same time, BGFs, PGFs, FGFs, right? Um, but the risk is that if we use this type of growth factors from the tissue engineering point of view to aid into the bone repair, we can create or put into the system supraphysiologically concentrations that are so high that can maybe create bone or more bone than the one that is required for bone formation or bone regeneration. This is something that drug delivery strategies in previous chapters of the book can help us to certainly control the tight mechanisms of bone regeneration and activation of these important populations of cells, the medicinal stem cells. If we want to talk about, and we're close to finalizing this lecture, if we want to talk about scaffolds for bone regeneration, we can certainly understand that we will have to use scaffolds or materials uh, that the skeletal stem cells that we have been discussing before can recognize and can feel comfortable with. There are many options like ceramics or hydroxyapatite type of materials or calcium phosphate or beta 3 calcium phosphates or phosphate or minerals like structures or materials that will allow us to be used, however these ceramics be used to regenerate bone, but however these ceramics are not very used nowadays because they don't stimulate bone formation. On the other side, we can use natural polymers like collagen, as we said before, or hyaluronic acid, which is one of the gags that we discussed before, to create biocompatible materials, to create materials that are can trigger minimal immunological responses or rejections. However, these materials, by definition, are organic, are soft, they are not mineralized, and we need to mineralize them in order to be used as materials for load-bearing applications, specifically, say, the femur, or the hip bones, or the bones in the spine, right? There is another option, which are the synthetic polymers, and these polymers are widely discussed in chapter 6 of this book. They are versatile because you can customize the physical and the chemical properties of these polymers to control cell response. You can tune them um, to have a specific location for enzyme degradation, for example. You can integrate side chains and immobilize biological molecules that could help trigger the regeneration of bone. So this chapter or these type of polymers are quite important, um, like PLGA, polycaprolactone, um, polyethylene glycol PEG type of materials, or the combination of glycolic acid and acetic acid, PLGA, or lactic acid, PGA type of materials that can uh, be used to customize the properties to accelerate bone regeneration. And finally, there are many hydrogels now that could be used in drug delivery, for example. Hydrogels have a high content of water and could be used to not necessarily create or make uh, replace bone by itself, but to deliver cells in the cell microenvironment. We saw that there are many cells in the bone marrow, hematopoietic and non-hematopoietic cells, that each of them have their own function, and we can use these hydrogels to inject or deliver specific either cells or growth factors or drugs to modulate bone healing and regeneration. With hydrogels, we can use gelatin, we can use collagen hydrogels, alginate to tailor the different amounts of collagen and different amount of polymer in the hydrogel to find the best delivery vehicle as possible. All these scaffolds, as I said before, need to be highly biodegradable. Um, Examples of these biodegradables, as I mentioned, is the polylactic acid, PLA, polyglycolic acid, PGA, combinations of both, polycaprolactone, epsilon caprolactone, PCL, and scaffolds that at the end of the day can be made to customize the mechanical properties, the porosity. As I said before, porosity is quite important in these strategies. And at the end of the day, scaffolds that can mimic the extracellular matrix, not only of bone, but in this chapter also on cartilage. Because that's what we want at the end of the day, to generate something that looks, feels, and behaves as close as possible to bone and cartilage. And finally, materials that can be um, vascularized. And here, what we have in this figure is how different biofabrication strategies can generate materials that are highly oriented and highly ordered, like the cortical and the trabecular bone, that can, all these green fluorescent signal are basically materials that can promote cell growth, cell attachment, cell proliferation, or even materials that you can, as I said before, hydrogels, as you can see here, that can be injectable and create a link, right, between two sides of tissue or bone and solve or fix something that we discussed before, which was what? Critical size defect, right? So the strategies are there, the efforts are there, and it would be a matter of time to see if we can translate these strategies to the clinic. Finally, if we have strategies that can accelerate vascularization, we already mentioned that vascularization is quite important. Um, and I'm going to change color here to something that is, blue. Blood vessel is quite important because the bone is highly metabolically active, it has a very high demand of nutrients and oxygen, proteins, and removal of waste products. That we need to find ways. One of the most important things is to create bone materials that are vascularized. You can vascularize before the implantation into a living organism, or during or after the implantation. But whatever strategy you use, um, the gap, as you can see here, right? The gap between the bone and the biomaterial, this could be a hydrogel, or this could be any biomaterial, will have to, and here the arrow is showing blood vessel. And blood vessel means life. More blood vessel means viability. And whatever strategy you put to fix both ends of bone, it has to have blood vessels. It has to fill in the osteon, right? The osteon has the Harvation canal. And the Harvation canal will need to have blood vessels. And if you have another osteon at the side, and this is a new osteon that probably is going to be synthesized within your new material, you can have Harvation canal, and you need to also create this connection, this Volkmann. We already discussed about the Volkmann canals that can connect horizontally a Harvation canal number one and a Harvation canal number two. So if we understand how the bone look like, we need to find strategies to create bone-like structures that resemble the natural counterpart as much as possible. So in general, this is we have come close to these chapters. We have seen many strategies. So what we've seen so far is how bone and cartilage look like. You will be able to definitely understand the development aspects of how we create bone, how we create cartilage. In joint development, we already discussed about long bones and how you can have ossification centers, articular cartilage at the ends, and how they can be used, or how can they be translated into regenerative strategies. We have talked about skeletal stem cells. We have talked about the role, their function, their multi-differentiation potential, the role of medicinal stem cells, the role of these cells to create bone, or to create bone and bone marrow, because these cells should create bone as well as the bone marrow. If we don't have bone marrow, then you've heard moments in which patients need a transplant of bone marrow, and this is something that is not good for this kind of patient. So we need to have a functional, metabolically active bone marrow as well, and these stem cells in bone have to have the subpopulations to create bone as well as bone marrow. Only bone is not good. We have seen the repair capacity of the articular cartilage. We have seen how the autologous chondrocyte implantation can help. We've seen the benefits and the limitations to put it in the clinic. So this is quite important to understand. We have seen the different type of bones or cartilage. We discussed about articular cartilage, and we've seen cortical bone, and we've seen spongy bone or trabecular bone. We have discussed about different biomaterials or scaffolds uh, to generate these structures. And we've discussed a little bit of growth factors, right? Growth factors like BMPs and VEGFs to not only create bone, but to create bone with vascularization. So it has been quite a pleasure to discuss with you, and I hope that you find this lecture series useful and helps you in your studies.